What is up, guys? My name is Lex and welcome back to my poker vlog. We're playing at the Seminole Hard Rock in Hollywood, Florida today. 5-10 no limit, buying in for $2,500. Let's get right into the action. In this first hand, there's a limp for $10 by a short stack player. I have ace-9 suited on the button and I decide to raise it up. Normally, I would go $50 over a limp, but given the fact that he only has about $450 behind, I only make it $40. It folds back around to him and he ends up making the call. The first flop we see early on a Tuesday morning comes out King, Deuce, 3, 2 hearts. We flop the nut flush draw with one overcard. My opponent checks to me. I put out a small down bet. I make it $25 and he ends up making the call. So heads up to the turn, which is the 4 of hearts. We make the flush, the best hand possible. Now the action's on my opponent who decides all of his chips are going in there. I ask the dealer if he's all in and he says yes. So I make the snap call. Going to the river, which is another king. It does pair the board. However, our flush is good. My opponent said he turned a straight. So, taking down a nice $600 pot to start off the session. Just a heads up, throughout this video, I'm going to talk about bankroll management. I'm going to talk about how much money you need at each stake if you want to play poker for a living. Then I'm also going to go over my bankroll story, how I built up my bankroll from 1-2 all the way up to playing 5-10. In this next hand, we look down at a premium pocket pair, pocket tens. I make it $35. The cutoff calls, button calls, and the small blind calls $35. So 4 ways to the flop, which comes off 9 high. This is basically the best flop we can get for our hand. I would expect all of my opponents to 3-bet over pairs like jacks, queens, kings, and aces, so I don't have to worry about that. And there's also really not many 2 pairs on this board either. I don't expect my opponents to be playing 9 deuce, deuce 3, or 9 3. So when it checks to me, I'm going to put out a pretty standard c-bet here. I make it $60. The cutoff folds, button folds, and the small blind makes a call. We're heads up to the turn, which is the 6 of spades. When my opponent checks to me, it does bring in a straight draw 4-5, which was open-ended on the flop, but it's a pretty safe card. I can still get value from all 9x hands, some flush draws now, and possibly lower pairs like 7s and 8s. I bet $125 and my opponent snap calls. I don't always rely on live tells, however, my opponent snap called my bet on the turn, and I would expect him to think about his options, either raising or calling if he had a straight, a 2 pair, or a set. So given the fact that he snap called me on the turn, I think he's most likely weighted towards 1 pairs or draws. So whenever he leads out for $250 on a jack of clubs river, this just doesn't make any sense. In the great words of Jeff Boski, what's he repping? My opponent looked pretty nervous whenever he put out that bet, and he doesn't look too comfortable now. I'm almost 100% sure that he's bluffing, and I'm going to make the call here. But while I'm tanking, you can see in the shadow above, I'm playing with my chips above the felt, and then something weird happens.
I didn't call you.
No, wait.
Beautiful.
One of my chips accidentally rolls out of my hand and falls into the middle of the pot. I tell the dealer right away that's not a call. The dealer tells the player it's not a call. However, he almost turns over his cards, and while he was almost turning over his cards, he looked at me and shook his head no, as if he didn't have anything at all and as if he was bluffing. So now I feel like I'm in a really weird spot. I feel like I almost angled this guy on accident. I basically got all the information I needed. If he had a big hand like 2 pairs straight or a set, he would probably turn his hand over right away, but he obviously looks like he was bluffing. So I think about it for a little bit of time. I don't think I can fold now. I feel pretty weird about the situation, and I end up making the call.
Really beautiful, but then Puerto Rico became very expensive, and the Bahamas and all the other places. St. Thomas,
I can beat a 9, man.
Dominican, yeah, everything was growing, and Puerto Rico. That's why Puerto Rico went broke, because they lost the tourism.
My chip dropped. I didn't mean to. I make the call and show my hand first, just so my opponent doesn't have to show his hand, and like I expected, he ends up mucking, so I feel a little bit bad about this spot. I obviously was not trying to angle him at all. It was a total accident on my part. I did tell the dealer right away that it wasn't a call, and the dealer did his job perfectly. He told the player it wasn't a call. However, sometimes accidents happen. It's at nobody's fault here. The player's not at fault. I'm not at fault, or the dealer. Sometimes things like this happen. We end up taking down this pot with pocket tens. Moving on here, we have an under the gun straddle to 25. I'm in the cutoff with 5-7 of spades and raise it up to $75. The button calls and the straddler ends up making the call. So 3 ways to the flop of king 7-3 with 1 spade. We flop middle pair and a backdoor straight and flush draw. When it's checked to me, I put out a c-bet. I make it $110. The button calls $110 and the straddler ends up folding. We're heads up to the turn, which is the jack of spades. Now we have a pair and a flush draw. I go back and forth whether I want to continue to bet or check on this card, and I think I'm going to get a lot of free rivers if I decide to check. I think he's only going to be betting his strong kings. He's probably going to check back with basically his entire range, except for hands like king jack, king queen, and ace king. So I decided to check. The button decides to put in a bet. He makes it $240 after thinking for a little bit of time, and now I have to decide what I'm going to do. And given this sizing into this pot, there's no way I can fold. I could potentially sometimes raise here, but that line wouldn't make too much sense. I think a check call is fine here, and if I do hit one of my outs, either a 7, a 5, or a spade, I can lead out huge on the river and try to get called. So after thinking for a little bit of time, I make the call for $240. The dealer collects our bets and puts them into the middle of an over $900 pot here. We're looking to improve to either a 7, a 5, or a spade. Going to the river, which is the 8 of hearts. We totally miss. The front door flush does get there. I think about potentially leading out huge here as a bluff, trying to get him off one pair, but I decided check, and he checks back. He shows king, queen, which is going to beat our 7, and he takes down this pot. Okay, let's talk about a topic that I get a ton of questions on every single week, and that is bankroll management. And the big question is, how much money do you need to play poker for a hobby or for a living? And I'm going to break this down into 2 categories. The first category is assuming you have a full-time job that pays your expenses and your bills, and you want to know how much money you need to play poker for fun and for some extra side income. For this category, I would recommend having a minimum of 10 buy-ins for the game you want to play. When I talk about buy-ins, I mean 100 big blinds for the game. So for 1-2, that's $200, and for 2-5, that's $500. So if we are going off the 10 buy-in minimum rule, you should have roughly saved up $2,000 for 1-2, around a minimum of $5,000 for 2-5, and then for 5-10, I would actually recommend having more like 15 to 20 buy-ins for a poker bankroll, which would be about $15,000 to $20,000, and this is because the game at 5-10 usually plays much bigger. All right, let's move on to the other category of how much money you need if you want to play poker full-time as your only source of income. And a lot of people dream of quitting their job and playing poker full-time, and in order to do that, you're going to have a large bankroll. In my honest opinion, it's pretty hard to make a living playing 1-2, no limit live poker for a living, so I would suggest to anybody to try to push themselves and at least play 2-5. The reason I say this is that the stacks are just so shallow at 1-2, and the rake is also very hard to beat. At the 2-5 game, the stacks are going to be much deeper, and people are going to be losing way more money per session, which can really help and increase your win rate. Okay, let's talk about numbers. So to play poker full time, I would suggest having a minimum of 30 to 40 buy-ins for the game. So for 1-2, that is a minimum of $6,000 to $8,000. For 2-5, you want to have a minimum poker bankroll of around $15,000 to $20,000. And for 5-10, I would actually suggest having more like 40 to 50 buy-ins, which would be about $40,000 to $50,000 minimum to play the game full time. If you want to play full-time for a living, you're going to have a larger bankroll with more buy-ins to take the downswings, to take the negative variance so that you can keep playing every single day and continue to get out of those downswings and make a good monthly profit. Ideally, if you have an edge over your opponents, you want to start buying in deeper for the game, possibly 200 to 300 big blinds deep, and I think the ideal buy-in should be around 200 big blinds if you're trying to play full-time. This way you can maximize your profit over other players, and as you can see, if we change the buy-in to 200 big blinds, this doubles the amount of money you need to play. If you want to play deep stack poker at the 2-5 level, you need to have close of $30,000 to $40,000 minimum, and at 5-10, I would recommend having upwards of $80,000 to $100,000 minimum if you're trying to play 200 big blinds deep for a living at 5-10. And of course, these are just my recommendations. Everyone's situation is different when it comes to money, bills, family, and life expenses. Not many people are lucky enough to have $20,000 to $50,000 just laying around to play poker with. If you don't have a ton of money, you're going to have to start from the bottom and work your way up. You're going to have to be patient enough to not play above your bankroll. It's going to be a long, slow grind and sometimes boring, but you risk going broke by playing in games way above your bankroll. And if you go broke, you can't even play at all. So the key is to be mentally strong enough to stick to these buy-in rules if you want to become a professional poker player. Bankroll management is one of the most important things in becoming a successful player long term. Stick around to the end of the video. I'm going to talk about my bankroll management story that got me from 1-2 all the way up to 5-10. But now let's get back into the action. Let's get on to the next hand. Mandatory straddle on. I open up to $75 with pocket eights from middle position. The button puts in a 3-bet to $225. The under the gun straddler cold calls the 3-bet, and I end up making the call as well. 3 ways to a flop, which comes off Jack 8 3 2 diamonds. We flop middle set in a 3-bet pot. I check, and the button unfortunately checks behind. The turn card is a jack. We make a full house. We have basically the best hand possible right now. The under the gun player checks again. I put out a pretty small bet here. I make it $225, just trying to get called by anything here. And unfortunately, the button folds and the under the gun straddler ends up folding, and we end up taking down this pot. I've been playing now for about 5 hours. I'm up about $300, so nothing too crazy. The mandatory straddle is on, so the pots are going to start getting bigger. Next up, the small blind makes it 75. I have ace-3 of diamonds in the straddle position and decide to 3-bet. I make it $225 and he ends up making the call. Heads up to the flop of 4, 5, 6, 2 diamonds. We flop an open-ended straight draw with a flush draw and 1 overcard. A huge flop for us. When check to me, I put out a bet. I make it $175. My opponent in this hand is another professional poker player who I have a ton of hours with. He is an action player who likes to mix it up and get in there with some funky hands and will put in some big bluffs. However, he's very experienced and knows exactly what he's doing. He thinks for a little bit of time and decides not to call. He decides to put in a check raise. He raises it up to $600. I quickly now glance over at his chips, and he has around $2,000 in his stack, so I really already know what I'm going to do. We started off this hand with a little over 100 big blinds in our stacks, given the fact that there was a $25 straddle on, and in this position, small blind versus straddle on this board in a 3-bet pot, there's just no way I'm folding. I rather just put all the money in and try to run it twice. If he has a set or a 2-pair, I'm definitely drawing live. He could even be check raising here with a worse hand like top pair and open-ended, second pair open-ender, maybe 7x of diamonds or even 8x of diamonds, so I could even get the money in good, and sometimes he could potentially fold some of his 1-pair hands, so I decide to tank for a little bit of time, put in a little Hollywood, count out my chips, and rip it all in. All in. All in. Once or twice?
2 times.
We get snap called and decide to run it twice. On the first board, I hit the nut flush, the best hand possible, and on the second board, I miss. I tell him I have a flush, and he shows 7, 8 of hearts for a flopped straight, so we got pretty lucky there, end up chopping up over a $5,000 pot. Sometimes you just got to close your eyes and go all in, and luckily this time we end up chopping it up versus the nuts. This is going to be the last hand we play on this session. After playing for about 7 hours, we are basically dead even. We end up racking up our chips, heading to the cage, and cashing out for the night. Alright guys, it is the next day here back at my house, and I want to talk a little bit about my poker bankroll management story. I talked about my suggestions of how much money you need for 1, 2, 2, 5, and 5, 10, but I want to talk about my start, how I started at 1, 2, how much money I had at 2, 5, and then how much money I had when I went to 5, 10. So basically, the first 4 or 5 months playing poker, I just could not seem to win. I had a tough time. I was breaking even, slightly losing. I was really trying to get better, trying to work on my game, talk to other friends, trying to get better. And after about 3 or 4 months of that, I had my first big winning month, December of 2018. I won $4,000 playing 1-2, and that just really propelled my poker career. I was able to finally have somewhat of a bankroll, and then January, February, March, I was doing pretty good playing 1-2, probably 150 hours a month. Then in April of 2019, I went to Vegas for the first time to play poker. I had a $7,000 bankroll, and when I got there, I thought, when you're in Vegas, might as well push myself, try to play some bigger stakes. Let's play 2-5. So I played 2-5 at Bellagio, played 2-5 at Venetian, Aria, and the Wynn. And after 5 days in Vegas, I won over $4,000. So my bankroll went from $7,000 all the way up to $11,000 just in a week. So when I got back to Florida, I didn't want to stop. I wanted to keep pushing myself, keep playing 2-5. So I started playing 2-5 regularly at the Hard Rock and at Magic City. And I would say that summer, the summer of 2019, was probably the biggest upswing I've ever been on in my poker career. I basically won almost every day in June, had a really good July and good August, and it just really helped me propel myself up to where I'm at now. And obviously there is some luck in poker. You got to hopefully run good. You got to win these big pots, but I obviously put a lot of work in too. So after playing 2-5 for about a year and a half or so, the quarantine hit, the lockdown hit, no more casinos. So whenever I was playing at home, I was grinding a ton of hours online. And I think that kind of helped me get to playing more 510. So whenever the lockdown ended in June of 2020, I started taking shots at 510, and at that time, I had a $50,000 bankroll. So I was probably underrolled for the game for sure. I was buying in for about $1,500 or $2,000, but I felt very comfortable about all those months that I played online, playing 2.5 and 5.10 online. I felt pretty comfortable. And then all the last year or so playing 2.5, I felt like I could do pretty well at 5.10. And if you guys have ever taken shots at bigger games before, you know how it is. The anxiety is up, your adrenaline is pumping, and that's how I felt playing 5.10 for the first time. I had some of my biggest wins and biggest losses my first week of playing 5.10. I sat down, very first session playing 5.10 at the Hard Rock, I won like $3,500, and then the very next day, I got set under set, flush under flush, and I lost like $4K. So I'm like, wow, this is crazy. These swings are huge. I got to get ready for it. So that is why I would recommend having more money. However, I was pretty aggressive with the bankroll management. I thought, look, if I lose it, I can just go back down to 2.5. And when I was at 2.5, if I lost it, hey, I could just get a job. So that was my thoughts. Obviously, my situation is different than some of you guys. I don't have any kids. I'm not married. At the time, I didn't even have a car payment. So I was able to really grow my bankroll up pretty easily. And I was super frugal. I did not spend hardly any money in the last 2 or 3 years. I didn't go on any crazy extravagant vacations. I didn't buy really expensive clothes. I wasn't spending a ton of money on all these things that I didn't really need. I was really trying to only spend money on what I needed. And my light just went out. So I guess we're just gonna wrap this one up here. Hopefully you guys can still see me well, but hope you guys enjoyed this video talking about bankroll management. Hopefully it helps answer some questions for you guys. And if you are really trying to become a professional poker player, remember, gotta stay consistent, gotta stay patient, be frugal, really study hard, play hard, and hope you guys do well. Hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, hit that like and subscribe button, comment down below, and until next time, I'll see ya.